Hello, it's Beth with Around the Table Yarns, and today we are finishing up our sweater club for 2024. You can see, maybe, I move my camera around. This is my oversized Wren sweater. Last time we did the seaming and finishing of the collar and the shoulders, and today we're going to be joining our sleeves. So this is my top of my shoulder and the two fronts of my sleeve, or the two fronts of my sweater. And I have this finished sleeve to add to it. I guess I could do that this way. So here's my finished sleeve. And the front is the top of my sweater. That's the neck. And there's the shoulder seam. And so we want to join the sleeve to the shoulder. I started this earlier, so I've got a little bit of a Julia Child thing where I can go and sew now. And I want to just I was grabbing my tools as Pam was starting the Instagram Live. So I just want to make sure I have a darning needle. Thank you for waiting. I had to go downstairs. They were in the pocket of my coat where they weren't supposed to be. So when you do a seam, so these were done with the 3-needle bind off, but they could have been done with the mattress stitch. And when you do a seam at the top of the shoulders, you are joining stitch to stitch. And so I use my fingers like this to sort of demonstrate that, but it's one stitch to one stitch all the way across. And when you join rows to rows, it's one row to one row all the way across. But when you join the top of the sleeve into the body of the sweater, it's stitches for the top of the sleeve and rows for the body of the sweater. So if we look at this here, I want to make sure this is in the camera. When we look at this here, this is the edge of my sweater, front and back, and I'm going to join the top of the sleeve to that. So they run perpendicular. The stitches here are running perpendicular to the rows on the other side. Okay. So the first thing that I like to do when I'm preparing this is I want to find this pattern very nicely, had a little bit of an addition where we cast on 2 stitches at the beginning of the 2 rows where the beginning of the sleeve shaping occurs. And so I want to actually fasten, at least temporarily, my end of my sleeve there. And so I'm going to pin it. And this is just to hold it in place while I start my seaming and to give me a place to go to. So I'm going to pin the corner of the sleeve here to the beginning of my sleeve shaping on the body. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the sweater. So here's my addition of stitches there. And so I'm going to pin the other edge, the other top edge of my sleeve on that side. but that gives you a big floppy space in the middle. So that's not the end of what you need to do. If I hold it up now, I've got it pinned on each edge, but I clearly want to pin it in the middle too, or at least secure it in the middle. And the way that I do that is I hold the ends together, and then I want to fold and find the middle of my sleeve. And my 3-needle bind off shows me so this is where the middle of my sleeve was, and this is my 3-needle bind off. So I could just pin that right there. And that will give me 3 points of contact. But it's still pretty floppy. I mean, there's maybe 8 to 10 inches or however many inches across from the top of the sleeve to the bottom of the sleeve. And so that's still kind of a floppy amount of space. So I've got it pinned in 2 places. So now I want to work on one side. And when I'm working on one side, you can see that one side, see how the one here rolls away and looks a little bit rounded, and the other one looks straight. So I want to find the halfway point in this stretch and secure it. So again, I'm pinching and folding, and I want to fold away from the longer piece. So I want the longer piece to be on the outside, and I want to kind of really find the middle of that. So I'm pinching to the middle of that, there's the middle, and then pinch to the middle of the other part. And that's where we want to join them. So that's pinching those 2 together. I'm not being super precise, but I am being kind of careful to get them in. And I am doing this under the camera and trying to show you as I go. So this isn't my best effort because I want you to see what I'm doing. But now you can see it maybe a little bit better because we're on the shorter segment. So this segment, I'm going to fold in. And so it's similar to easing in a sleeve and sewing. I mean, it is easing in a sleeve and sewing, but you can see there's a little bit of discrepancy between the length of the top of the sleeve and the space in the along the front or the back of the sweater. And so we want to be able to take up any slack really evenly along the seam that we're going to make. So I've divided the length of the sleeve in half, and then in half again, and then in quarters, and pinned it along the way. This time, need more hands. And so when I'm done with that, it should look fairly even across and be, these are kind of wonky, but that gives me a starting point to hold the sides together as I begin to sew. When I sew, I always go towards the underarm. So if this is the front of my, so we had these little bumps on the ends of our sleeve shaping on the body of the sweater. So what I've done is I've put the sleeve into that space and I've pinned it here at the halfway point of the sleeve, and I've pinned it here and I've pinned it here, and then I folded it in half and pinned it at the halfway point and here, and I would do that again so that you're pinned all the way along as you're going. When I start to sew, I don't want to sew from the underarm across to the other underarm. I want to start at the center of the top and go towards the underarm with my stitches, because if there's any discrepancy, I want that to be under my armpit and not at the top of my shoulder or at the front of my sweater. So what I usually do is take a piece of yarn that's long enough to do this whole seam, but I join it and fold it in half so that one half will go in this direction and the other half will go in that direction. Conversely, if you have yarn there already from doing your 3-needle bind off, which I do, you can use that and then join another piece to go in the opposite direction, and that's perfectly valid. There's no rule that says you have to join new yarn. When I start, I want to make sure, will this go closer? No, we'll only go closer if I go closer. Okay. As I do my seaming, I like to see, so you want the right sides of the fabric facing you. And you may have noticed when you did a gauge swatch that there are fewer stitches than there are rows in a gauge swatch. And that's because stitches are wider than the rows are tall. And so when we're seaming these things together, you want to keep that in mind. So here's my halfway point pin. I want to go, I'm going to start, my yarn is attached to the body of the sweater. So I want to go first to the sleeve cap. My pin is right here. It's very similar color, but I'm going to use this stitch that's immediately to the left of the pin, and I'm going to go under the stitch. So up here is the bind off of this stitch right here. And I want to go as close to the bind off as I can and under both legs of the stitch. Then I want to go back to the opposite side where my 3-needle bind off is. I'm going to unpin this because it's attached now, and that's kind of in my way. And I want to go in. So recognize the V of a stitch. That is one full stitch in from the edge. So here's here's a whole stitch, but the edge stitch is usually a little distorted. And then the V of the next stitch is fully visible. Between those two stitches is the yarn that attached them. So if you put your needle tip in and run it parallel in the same direction as the stitch that you're trying to follow, you can pick up one strand of yarn, and that's the yarn that made the row. It's actually the row above it, but it's the one that runs sort of alongside of that stitch. So I'm going to pick up that one strand of yarn, and I'm going to go, now I have one here, and I've picked up the whole stitch here. I'm going to pick up a whole stitch again. So I go in where I came out of. This is my yarn from before, and this looks a little bit broad, but this is the opening that I came out of. And so I'm going to go to the next stitch, both legs of the next stitch, immediately below the cast off edge. And I'm leaving that loose intentionally right now, but it will pull up. And then on the other side, because of my gauge, I found that it was better if I did 1 and then 2 rows. So 1 row and then a stitch, and then 2 rows and then a stitch. Often it's 1 row, 1 row, and then 2 rows. So right now I'm doing, if I pull this out, you can see I've got 1 row that's pulling here, and then there's 2 rows that are pulling here. So I've picked up 1 and then 2. So there's 3 rows on that side and 2 stitches. And for my gauge, those 3 rows are about the same width as my 2 stitches. So that works out the best for me. In other situations, you might have 1 row, and then 2 rows. So 4 rows equal 3 stitches, or even 5 rows equal 4 stitches. But those are the most common proportions for picking up stitches from the top to the bottom. And then I'm going to pull it. I'm going to pull my working yarn, and it makes all of that extra yarn disappear, and it pulls this 2 sides of the seam together. So you can see the perpendicular line of here's the sweater stitches lined up, and here are the sleeve stitches going in the opposite or in the perpendicular direction. If I want to see the next stitch, it's kind of hard when you've pulled it. And so I pull out a little bit from the edge, and that makes the yarn that I'm working with move. And I can see where it's coming from. It's coming from right there. So I did 1 and then 2. So I'm back to 1. I put the tip of my needle in where it's coming out of. So again, I'll just move that so you can see it. So my yarn, this is my sewing yarn. I'm putting my needle in where it's coming out of. I'm running parallel. So parallel to the edge, and I want to pick up 1 strand. I want to come in where I came out of on the sleeve side and pick up a whole stitch. So you're going under both legs of 1 stitch as close as you can to the top of that cast off. And now I'm going to go back up to where I came out of on the front of the sweater, and I'm going to pick up 2 rows. So I'm alternating between 1 and 2 rows. But every time I come to the sleeve side, I'm only picking up 1 stitch at a time. So that was 2. I'm going to pick up 1, pick up 1 stitch, back up, pick up 2. When I've done that, it's about 1 inch. I've done it a couple times. It's about 1 inch of sewing. That's as far as I want to go before I pull on my working yarn, because I don't want to stress this working yarn and make it break. And it is not the strongest. So 1 inch is as far as I want to go. Of course, now it doesn't want to go. If it doesn't pull out easily, you can pull it part way. Along. So I'm securing it with my thumb. I'm just trying to just guide it, but there, I pulled it a little bit harder, and you can see that these stitches are just teeing right in to the line of rows on the other side. Okay, this is looking pretty good over here, so we'll continue. So I've come out of this side. I'm going to just double check. I've gone through 2. So I'm going to come down here and pick up 1 stitch. Sorry, I didn't realize that was so out of focus. So I'm come down to the sleeve side and picked up 1 stitch. And then I go back up and go in where I came out of and pick up 1 row. Might as well pull that up, pick up 1 stitch at the top of my sleeve, 2 rows, one stitch, 1 row, and 1 stitch, and that gets me right up to the marker on both sides. So give it a little tug to straighten those up, and that's my first section. So my first section came out evenly. I would do that with each of the other 4 sections. There should be yarn left over to weave in, but if you run out, you can just push this through where it's coming out of to the other side. So let's say I wanted to change my sewing yarn. I could push that through to the other side. And then start with a new strand, leaving the tail on the other side to come out. Let's just do that so it's not. So I could push, I'm sorry, I should push it through where it is coming out of to the far side. So if you run out, so if you use a tail and you run out of yarn, you want to just push it into the other side and then leaving a tail, come out that same opening and restart your sewing. Is that clear? Okay. Any questions? Okay. So that's stitches to rows. And again, I found for my gauge that 2 stitches equaled 3 rows of knitting. But in some cases, you'll find that it's 4 rows of knitting to 3 stitches or 5 rows of knitting to 4 stitches. So it just kind of depends on your gauge. One of the members of our group this morning counted her stitches and rows, and actually the way that we did this, we could have known how many rows we had from the beginning of the armhole shaping to the top before we did our short rows. And we know how many stitches we bound off. So you could just do the math. And if you had, 100 rows and 50 stitches, you'd want to do 1 for every 2. If you had 75 rows and 50 stitches, you'd have to figure out the proportions to make them come out evenly. So I usually eyeball it. If I had done this, and I did do this earlier today, I picked up 3 for every 4, 3 stitches for every 4 rows, and it was not even when I got to the first marker. And so I pulled it back and switched to 2 rows, 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So I do do a little bit of trial and error, and I find that that works pretty well for me. But again, the proportions are always slightly different. The only time the proportions are exactly the same is if you're doing garter stitch. Garter stitch, one ridge will equal 1 stitch. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio for garter stitch, because the garter stitch row height is the stitch width and the row height are equal or more equal with garter stitch. All right. Now, the other part of the sewing that we have to do is the end of the sleeve. And in this case, you don't need to do pinning if you don't want to. The sleeve ends, because this was knitted in one piece, beginning at the cuff and going all the way up, the sleeve ends should have increases. And if you made visible increases, there's my increase right there. So there's a little bump because I did a knit in the front and the back for my increase. And there's one right there. So my sleeve increases, if I wanted to, I could pin those if I wanted to just have them in the right place. But if I pick up the same number of stitches or rows on each side, then they should be the same when I get to there. So I'm going to again use the tail that was left when I cast on these stitches. And to get set up and started here, you kind of have to find the corner. And it's a little deceptive where the corner is, but if you follow this line, it goes all the way up to the top. And so this is the edge stitch next to the last full stitch. So I'm going to go from the very top, from the very edge in alongside of this full stitch that I can see. And I'm going to do the same on this side. It's kind of looping back on itself when I do it on this side, but I'm going to go in where my yarn is coming out from. And that's so I join it with as little of a bump as possible. And then I want to stay alongside of these stitches. So I'm going to go in where I came out of, and because I'm doing the same, my rows are the same on both sides, I can go 2 at a time if I want to. So I can go in where I came out of and then follow along and pick up 2 rows, go to the other side of the sleeve, go in where you came out of and pick up 2 rows. In where you came out of, stay parallel to this line, this side of the stitches, in where I came out of and under 2, in where I came out of and under 2. And again, I found that it's better to pull this sooner than later so that I get less wear on my yarn. It's hard once you've pulled it together to see where it's coming from. So I always give it a little pull apart and I can see the movement of the yarn. So this yarn is the one that I'm attached to. You can see it move over there. So if I go in where it's coming out of and under 2, so I'm coming parallel to the line of stitches that I want to stay to the left of, and I'm going under 2, connecting yarns between this stitch and the one next to it. Go back where I came out of on the other side and under 2. So it can go a little bit faster when you're doing the sleeves because you can do 2 at a time. If you pull too tightly, it will gather in the seam. And so if you do pull too tightly, you can just pull it up along and stretch it back out so it's not gathered in. You want this to lay as flat as possible. We're going to do that all the way into the armpit. You want to check as you go to make sure that you're lining up with your increases and that you're staying close to the edge. So where the increases start, it can get a little bit muddy. And you want to make sure that you're continuing to stay as close to the edge of the knitting as possible. So here's where my increase is, right where my thumb is. That is a new stitch that was created. And so I want to stay on the seam edge of that when I make my stitches. And I should be in the same place. Yep. On this side. So I want to come out on the seam edge of that on this side. Then we're just going to keep going all the way up to the armhole. When we get to the armhole, the remaining yarn will be secured in the seam. So let's just look at the seam here. So I will be looking at a seam like this, and you're just going to go into the seam back and forth. I often just go 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 times, pull it through, and then double it back on itself. And then I trim it because it's not going to go anywhere, especially if you've doubled it back on itself. The other part of this pattern is that there's a turn up for the sleeve, or a hemmed sleeve. And so you can, just like we did for the collar, you can turn the sleeve under about 1 inch and stitch it down, you know, not coming all the way through to the other side, but just stitching down the edge. I think alternately, since it's not shaped at the edge, if you like the sleeve as a rolled cuff, you could leave it as a rolled cuff, but it's going to be 1 inch longer than originally planned. So it's kind of up to you. If you like the sleeve a little bit shorter, or you like a more finished edge to the sleeve, you would just tuck that under and do the same technique that we used for turning under and tacking down the collar. So that is all of the information for how to finish and how to do the seaming for the Wren sweater. And that brings us to the end of the Wren sweater. I really liked this pattern. One of the things we found was that you could seam if you wanted to. This is what Maureen, when she came on, was talking about. You could choose, instead of doing a more traditional mattress stitch, you could go from bump to bump of these garter bumps. So here's a garter bump. You could go from one side to the other, just picking up the garter bumps. And it would create a kind of a seam. So I think this is what the designer intended when they put the garter edge on, was for there to be sort of something to grab onto and make an even seam. But when you do that, it leaves a visible kind of, it seems to me a little bit rougher. So I'm going to just point that out. So here's what my seam looks like, and it's invisible. And here's what, if you go from bump to bump, it leaves a visible seam that looks like, you know, a stitch of garter stitch on the underside of your sleeve or on the side of your sweater. I don't love that. That's, to me, that's not a really attractive seam. So I would avoid it. And that's an option that you have, is you can do things the way that they make it easier for, or you can do things with a more traditional mattress stitch. I'm going to pull those stitches out because I'm not going to leave them that way. If you are sewing your sweater, it is important to know that not all yarns sew up as well as others. The one that I'm using is a very loosely spun wool. And if I use too long a strand of it, I will wear it out. The yarn, as it's pulled through all of the stitches, that yarn abrades. It's not like sewing thread, and it will eventually wear out and kind of fall apart. So I try to use only about 18 inches or less when I have a weaker yarn like this. If you have a weaker yarn, you also have the option of substituting a similar color with a different fiber. So a cotton yarn could be used, a more smoothly spun woolen yarn, wool yarn, not woolen spun, could be used. I would never use a tweed. I would never use a single ply. So this one is a 2-ply, but it's not real strong. So I want to be very aware and careful as I'm going that I'm not abrading and wearing out my sewing yarn too quickly. And if you really have a problem with that, then grab some sock yarn, grab some cotton acrylic blend, and do your seam without using the same yarn as your sweater. It's important, if you do that, to make sure that it is not something that will shrink if you're not going to be hand washing your sweater. So do keep materials in mind, but the sewing yarn is really important. And this is awfully long for a piece of sewing yarn. This can get worn and then they just sort of come apart as you're sewing with them. So you want to be really careful about that. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's Wren sweaters, and I hope that people have enjoyed doing it. Give us a call if you have any questions. We will be setting up the sweater club for 2024, and we're going to be doing the quintessential cardigan from Church Mouse Yarns and the Order of the Garter from Anna Maria Otvos. Those are the two patterns that we'll be using. I have them begun on a new page for our website, and they'll be up shortly, and we'll send an email to let you know that that's ready. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a comment.
Okay.
Remember you told me how to figure out like a proportion for figuring out how much, if you only had a little yarn for the sweater, how to divide it up for sleeves and stuff. That's what I have left.
Did it work?
Yarn chicken. Well, yeah, then I found I had a little more, but seriously.
You won a yarn chicken. Good for you.
I wanted to tell you.
Well done. So what did I say? Or you're muted again, sweetie.
Sorry, it's in my notes and I don't remember, but I weighed the yarn and then I used the proportion, this much for the sleeves and this much for the back, and it worked.
So it's a third for the front, a third for the back, and a sixth for each sleeve.
Yes, and it worked great. And I'm really gonna love this sweater.
That especially works if the front and the back are identical, and that was the case.
Right.
The sleeves are identical. There are very few sweaters where the sleeves aren't identical, but there are some that are asymmetric. But when you have a symmetrically worked project and the sleeves and the front and the back are all roughly, the sleeve takes about a third of the yarn. So if you take the total weight and divide it by 3, and then take one of those thirds and divide that in half, you'll have enough for all the parts. Or you'll have short sleeves.
Yes, and this is going to be nice and long. I can't believe it. And I have all this yarn left.
Now you spun this yarn, right?
Yes. I don't want to give myself a bad name, but man, hand spun is the nightmare to do mattress stitch.
You might want to get a waste yarn, a cotton acrylic blend, a machine made one, a non-hand spun, only because unless it's really tightly plied, it's not good for sewing.
Well, what I meant was I'm doing the bump to bump joining.
Oh, you are doing the bump to bump.
And I can't even tell what's a bump and what's not, because the stuff is very bumpy.
It is very bumpy.
But I'm loving it. It's Shetland and it has a nice drape.
It does. It looks lovely.
So I am tickled to death, even though it's kind of a bitch.
Well, congratulations. I expect to see your sweater soon. If not in the store, at least on Zoom. And I'm delighted to have worked with you guys on Sweater Club. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much.
Have a great holiday. Sweater Club is coming back the 3rd, I think it's the 3rd Monday of January, and we'll be starting the quintessential cardigan. We'll be starting with sizing and gauging.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Laura.